All right. So, welcome back to Sociological Theory. um, this is for the week of November 1st through the 5th. Um, so, this is for that week, and we are going to be talking about modern day feminism and womanism. Modern day feminism and womanism is what we're going to be discussing for in this lecture. First thing I want to do is I want to remind you about your sociological theory paper. Make sure, I believe it's due November 22nd, but don't quote me. Just make sure that you go and you look at that and remember that you have a due date for that paper coming up. So the next, big thing that you will have to complete for this class will be that paper. And then also you will have a final exam for this class. So make sure you're staying on top of your work. Make sure you're staying on top of your discussions. Make sure you're staying on top of your assignments. You should be good. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to me. Some of you, I've been having more and more students come into the office hours, and we've been having some really good conversations about the topics. And other students, of course, have questions about their class, have questions about the class, or questions about grades and things like that. So, hopefully I've addressed all of your concerns, and if any of you have any, feel free to reach out to me. So with that being said, let's go right into the next slide, which is Revolutionary Road. So as I was preparing for this lecture, reading the articles that I assigned to you, rereading those, familiarizing myself with the topic again, I immediately thought about just movies that I've seen in the past. And sociology isn't just something that I study, but it's something that I actually have been, I guess, engaging in without even really knowing it. I've just been engaging in this work because I've always been interested in the topics for a long time around race and gender and inequality and history and culture and people and all these different things, right? So I remember years ago, I remember watching this DVD. I forgot where I got the DVD from, or maybe maybe I just saw it and was like, oh, that sounds like an interesting story. Let me get it. Like I forgot how, or maybe I rented it or something. I can't remember. But I saw this movie called Revolutionary Road. Okay, see what this is about. And so I watched it and it was so powerful. It wasn't a movie that I probably would typically watch, but I was very intrigued by it. I hadn't really studied feminism at the time. I didn't really know. I knew a little bit about it, but not much. This was before social media really became what it is today. And I think social media has helped to spread ideas around racism, critical race theory, feminism, systemic racism, all these different things that are now popular terms in everyday conversation. But at this time, it wasn't really like that. But this movie definitely was a movie that promotes a lot of the ideas around feminism and shows the complexities of what American life was like prior to the second wave of feminism. So we've talked about the first wave. We've talked about the fight for voting rights. We've talked about the Declaration of Sentiments. We've talked about Ida B. Wells. We talked about Sojourner Truth. We've talked about so many people that have influenced the initial cause for the organized fashion of the women's movement in the United States. You have the second wave coming about in around the 1960s and the 1970s of the second wave of feminism. And but there were people in like the 50s and the 60s who saw this coming, right? And who got on board early, and were the pioneers for this second wave of feminism. And so Betty Friedan was one of those people. We're going to talk about Betty Friedan in a second in her book, The Feminist Mystique. And so with this movie, I'm kind of going back and forth, but what this movie Revolutionary Road does is it is a movie that deals with American life in a post-World War II time period, right? And it's a movie that would be difficult for anybody who's born after the 1970s to watch, because the way in which they deal with women's issues, which was a reality, but it's tough to watch. It's tough to see the level of oppression that women had to deal with. And it was painted and couched in this idea of freedom, idea of economic freedom, suburban life, idea of the American family. But when you pull back the layers of all these things, you see that women, particularly white suburban women, are going through a level of depression, a level of oppression that a lot of people were not speaking to. And Betty Friedan was one of the few who initiated that. I don't know if she initiated it, but she popularized that conversation through the writing of The Feminist Mystique. And this movie talks about basically what Betty Friedan was discussing in that book that she wrote in the 1960s, The Feminist Mystique. So the film itself is a story about two people, April and Frank Wheeler. They're a married couple. Frank is played by Leonardo DiCaprio, one of my favorite actors. Like the dude is brilliant. Like he's just an incredible actor. Leonardo DiCaprio, I think Kate Winslet is an incredible actress. Absolutely, both of them are legends. And so, and the way in which they play off of each other in this, I really feel like this should have definitely gotten more love. I don't even think Leonardo DiCaprio has ever gotten an Oscar. I think him, Will Smith, a couple other people have never gotten Oscars. And so I think, if I'm not mistaken, and I know they've been snubbed for sure. So, but yeah, both of them are very good in this movie. They both play two people living in a post-World War II American dream. So they have the suburban life, the house outside the city is quiet. They have the yard. It's them two together. I want to say they're working on having a family. And they're newly married. He has a good job. She's a housewife. And so it looks like they're living very well. But as the movie goes on, you start to see this American dream turn into an absolute nightmare. You start to see that life is not what it seemed to be, and life is not what they portrayed it to be, and life is not what the American dream portrayed it to be. First for Kate Winslet as the woman, April Wheeler, and then for Frank. And you start to see issues within their marriage and their house and things going on, and they're bringing out these larger conversations around gender and around the limits that are placed on women in America at this time. So it's through this era that Betty Friedan describes the feminist mystique, the feminist mystique. And actually, Kate Winslet read that book while she was preparing for this role, so that she can get into the mindset of what life was like for women growing up in post-World War II America, and how it's difficult when you know life is supposed to be better for you. you know that it's people are telling you this is the best life, but you don't feel that way. And that's what she's going through in this film. Um, and so what we start to see as the film goes on is that April and Frank are supposed to be different, but they're not different at all. And they're actually the same as everybody else. They start off being, you know, uh, feeling like we're going to be different than every other suburban couple, and we're going to do this and do that. And they end up going into the same kind of routine, and it ends up driving them both crazy. Um, the difference, though, is because Frank is a man, he has choices, right? He has choices, he has options, he has ways in which he can move, he has respect, and he has a certain level of identity that Kate Winslet does not have because she's a woman. And this takes place in like the 1955, in the 1950s. And so Frank went into the city every day, you know, on the train to go to work with all these other men. And so he had a life. And April was stuck at home all day, every day at home, right? And so this is what this text or this movie shows through this text, The Feminine Mystique, that while the American dream in the 1950s was seen as being this time where it was freedom for everybody, it was, you know, the Japanese are destroyed, the World War II is over, the Germans and Nazi Germany is destroyed, and now America is definitely has cemented themselves as the number one superpower in the world alongside Russia, right, at that time. And so it should be a great time for everybody, but the argument is that it's not for women. They're both bored out of their mind. They both hate their lives, but at least Leonardo DiCaprio, because he's a man, has a certain level of movement and freedom that Kate Winslet does not have because she has no choices and no options. And so what you really start to see in this text is what Betty Friedan talks about in her book, The Feminine Mystique, through the concept of the problem with no name. She talks about, or she says in an interview about the book, it was the era of prescription medication, you know, and women really started to believe maybe I'm crazy because I don't want this life. And I think there's something wrong with me. And so these women, again, talking mostly about white women, Black women have a whole nother scenario that they're going through at this time. But white women are told, well, before this, we were in the Depression. And before that, it was the Roaring 20s, it was the 1920s. Life was not as good as it is now. I mean, there's so much, there's so many options for life as a American white person. Why don't I feel happy? Maybe I'm not being appreciative of what I have. I have a house, I have kids, I have a life. All I have to do is stay home and cook and clean, take care of the children. Why am I not happy? And so you start to see that women are starting to, white women specifically, are starting to think about this, and this is going back and forth in their minds, but they don't feel like they can express this because this is a time period in which having these kind of discussions and this kind of dialogue, there's a pushback, not only from the men, but also from other women, especially older women. So you have somebody as young as Kate Winslet in this movie, somebody in her 20s, and she has a mother in her 40s or 50s who's saying, do you not appreciate the fact that you have a man that has a good job and can give you a house? And I didn't have this kind of life. I didn't grow up with these kind of options and freedoms. You're complaining about this? And so this is what the common woman is going through, or this is what majority white women are going through at this time, which causes Betty Friedan to take a deeper look into the real life of the housewife specifically during this time to say, maybe things aren't as good as we think they are. And maybe we need to take a deeper dive into what it's like for the American housewife. So I want you to watch this clip. It has some very strong language, so be prepared. But I think this clip is going to give you a really good sense of how this anger, this frustration, this misunderstanding, these misinterpretations, the frustration and everything just comes to a head with these two characters. So check that out and then come back. All right. So as you can see, it got real. So Revolutionary Road is basically just a movie that shows you what life was like for women before this second wave of feminism. And it's a very important history lesson that deals with gender and women's rights and women's issues that is actually not that long ago. Actually, during a time where maybe some of your parents were born, and maybe even your grandparents, for sure your grandparents were probably born, or even Kate Winslet's age at that time. And again, maybe even some of your parents. So it's not really that long ago, right? Definitely a movie I suggest you watch. If we were together, I would probably show it. I'm pretty sure you can probably find it, download it somewhere. I know your generation probably knows how to bootleg movies better than I do. But even if you just want to buy it on YouTube and watch it, it's a really good film. So Revolutionary Road, and talking about that kind of leads me to this other conversation around what life was really like for this traditional American family. And when you think about the traditional American family, you probably remember, maybe you've seen your parents watch it, or maybe your grandparents watch shows like Dennis the Menace, Leave It to Beaver, and shows like that, where you had the husband, you had the wife, you had the kids, and the kids would get in trouble and they would get punished for getting into mischief. And by the end of the show, the family comes together and they resolve whatever problem it is. So you have the birth of the American sitcom. And so when we look back on it, scholars and mainstream media often say, man, this was really the best time in American life. This was the time where the family was solid. And you had the mother and the father and the children in the home, and everything was together. And they were living in these middle-class suburban homes. That's where you get the phrase husband, wife, kids, and or 2.5 kids, the white picket fence, and the dog, right? So this is where you get that kind of dialogue and conversations around what life was like. And Kuntz, a scholar by the name of Kuntz, did research and found that there was a lot of inequality in the traditional family. A lot of people like to say that, oh, well, this was during a time where women were pure and they weren't having sex before marriage, and they waited till they were married to have sex and have children, and this was a time of purity. And what a lot of research shows is actually teenage pregnancy was pretty high in the 1950s. Teen pregnancy was high. I want to say it was not acceptable, but abortions were real. Terminating pregnancy was very real. It was still extremely taboo. Abortions were even taboo when I was growing up. Now it's not as much in some communities, and in other communities, it's still very much taboo. But it was real. It did happen, particularly in the 1950s and in the 1960s. But even outside of that, there were other aspects of inequality in the traditional family. Number one, people like to suggest that there was this harmonious domestic life, but behind the facade of this family that looked to be content, there were these unresolved issues, tensions, dissatisfactions among women. But a lot of this was suppressed because of the social pressures of women being appreciative of having such an easy life in suburbia, right? But in reality, it was very violent in those homes.
it was not uncommon for men to hit their wives. And in fact, in many cases, it was acceptable. Um, this is an article from the 1960s where they interviewed these men from Brooklyn, New York. And if you can, make it bigger and read it, the name of the article is "If a Woman Needs It, Should She Be Spanked?" And all four of these men give reasons as to why a woman should be spanked. If you've seen ads, and you can look it up, you can Google it, women being spanked, 1960s ads, 1950s ads. And these were actually advertisements in newspapers and in magazine articles where a man is in a chair similar to the one I'm in right now, and his wife is in or a woman, I'm assuming it's his wife, is in a maid outfit, and he has her bent over with a hairbrush in his hand, and he's spanking her, and her legs are flapping, right? As if she's a child. And he's spanking her, and I forgot what they were actually advertising, but this was real, right? It was not uncommon for women to be hit if they talk back to their spouses, if they got loud, if they didn't do their job. There were still times where you could be arrested for that in certain areas, in certain places, but especially if you had money, not really. Now, more recently, domestic violence is a much bigger issue. People take that more seriously than they did in the past. And because of that, you can get in a lot more trouble now than you could back then because of domestic violence, right? Also, there was a lot of control over women's sexuality during this time. Men could, it wasn't good, but a man could cheat, a man could have, several families, and that wasn't uncommon in those days. But if a woman had an affair, that was a big deal, for sure. Sex and sexuality, and we'll go more into this in a second, but sex and sexuality was all about the man. Is the man being pleased? Is the man having an orgasm? Ideas around women pleasure. Women aren't supposed to have pleasure. Women aren't supposed to orgasm. This is for men. Women are supposed to allow this to happen so that they can procreate. This is what life is like. Right. So there was a lot of control over women's sexuality, women's movement, opportunities for school, opportunities for jobs were nowhere near as high as they are now. Nowhere near as high as they are now. And so even if you did have a college, even if a woman did have a college degree, even if she did have skills, her overall goal was still to marry a man that had money and have his children. That was her way of getting a good life. And many of the mothers and the grandmothers felt the same way, and that's just the way life was. So women's movements were very much regulated. Her sexuality was regulated, and violence towards women in the family wasn't acceptable, but there were little consequences for it, right? All right, so let's go to the next slide. So now we're going to dig deeper into Betty Friedan, and particularly this notion of the problem that has no name. So this is the main concept that we're going to talk about. And the problem that has no name comes out of the book, The Feminine Mystique. So if you are a gender scholar, if you are a feminist, if you do see yourself as a gender scholar, then this text is absolutely a text that you should have in your library, or at least should be a text that you know about. And so, yeah, very similar. If you're a race scholar, Souls of Black Folk is that text that you should absolutely start with. And
in terms of, understanding race scholarship. If you study class, if you study social class and the rich and the poor, then what would that be for sociologists? Of course, Marx, capital, anything coming out of Marx's text, but for sure capital. A Marx reader is something that would have to be in your canon. So even if you didn't have the book, you should definitely know about it, know a lot about that. So Betty Friedan is just one of those people. So the feminine mystique, absolutely, if you're a gender scholar, it's very important. And then like a Black woman scholar, like if you're a Black feminist scholar, then, feminine mystique is still important. But then, of course, you would have to know voices from the South, Anna Julia Cooper, and then, of course, Black feminist thought is that key text for you. So just for those people who are who are seriously really considering sociology and you're trying to figure out what path you're on, these are the books that you should start with, depending on where it is you're trying to go within your research and your journey. So feminine mystique, again, like we talked, or like we said earlier, looks into the state of American women in the post-World War II era. And it gives us insight into the potential of femininity and how that was sacrificed for the home and for the family, the sacrifice that women made for the home and for the family. And when the World War II ended, a lot of the men returned home. And when they got home, the women were pushed back into the domestic spaces. So prior to that, when the men were all fighting in the war, women took over those jobs. That's where you see the famous image. I forgot what it's called. Was it Betty the Worker or something like that? I can't remember. Jane the Worker, but it's the famous picture of the woman with making the muscle. And I think it's like one of the most famous images in American history. We've all seen it to some degree. You can just look that up, woman making muscle or something, Google that, you'll know what I'm talking about. But so this was women entering the workforce, doing for themselves, getting educated, all these different things. When men came back, it was automatic. All right, we don't need you anymore, women. You can go back into the homes. You can go back to having babies. You can go back to taking care of your husbands, right? And so with World War II pushing women back into these domestic spaces and inventing the legitimate occupation of the homemaker, Friedan is saying that post-World War II America gave birth to what she calls the feminine mystique. And inside of the feminine mystique is this larger problem that she says has no name. It is the problem with no name. And she says this mystique problem that has no name is the problem of the woman who returned home, took care of the house and the children, but she was still frustrated. She was still frustrated because she could not fully be herself. That is the feminine mystique. She could not truly be what she was intended to be and not have the opportunities and not have the limitless bounds to be able to walk in her full humanity. And so Betty Friedan's idea of the problem that has no name is really just a critical take of the transparent strings that are forced by gender oppression, sexism, gender inequality, and then spatial exclusion, keeping women out of jobs, keeping women out of schools, keeping women out of
the social clubs that will provide them with economic growth, not the ones where they just sit around and talk and drink tea and talk about their husbands. I'm talking about the ones where they may do that, but then they also are doing things to help their community, to push society forward, to challenge inequality, to provide funds for other little girls that may want to go to school or that may need to get a job. Unfortunately, they were excluded from all these areas and all these spaces, and they were forced to be and stay in the home. So gender depression and spatial exclusion were the two things that created this problem with no name. So what is the problem that has no name? It is the depression and the lack of satisfaction that women had once they were forced to go back to the homes. Once they were forced to limit their abilities to just washing dishes, vacuuming floors, and having children. And so Friedan argues that this post-World War II United States, it shaped this idea of what the feminist mystique is in order to justify the larger discrimination that women were going through and their exclusionary practices that existed to keep them outcasted from the public sphere, from the public eye, from the public influence. And this was done to reinstitute men's position as higher in the conservative social order. This was done intentionally. And so this is how this era shaped what Betty Friedan calls the feminist mystique. And so when you look at early developments of social life during that time, when you look at ideas around early marriage, developments of early marriage, by the time a woman is 18, 19, girl, where's your husband? Fix yourself up. Get you a dress. Dye your hair blonde. That's another thing. We're going to talk about that. Oh, yeah, we're going to talk about that in a second. Dye your hair blonde. Put on some makeup. Get you a man. If you're 20, 21, and you don't have a husband, something's wrong with you. You're getting old. When you going to start having kids? I mean, super young. Soon as you're 18, this is the time. Your beauty's gonna fade soon. Let's grab you a husband quick. A large number of children giving up on education. All of this was done to help form this ideal image of happiness. If you want to be happy, we're not worried about education. We're not worried about a job. Have kids, get married early. So the woman was defined as having equal rights with her husband. And that's what they thought, or that's what they stated. And those rights were manifested in, yes, freedom that these women had. They had the freedom to choose furniture. They had the freedom to buy a washing machine, buy appliances. They had the freedom to buy the family car. Yes, they had those freedoms. But real freedom, they did not have. So self and home care were all supposed to give women the right amount of happiness that they needed. If you take care of your husband, if you take care of your children, you'll be happy. That's where you will find joy. That's where you will find dignity, because you're a woman. And so women in the 1950s and in the 1960s, according to Friedan, didn't give a lot of attention to what was going on the outside. Because as you know, historically, there's a lot going on the outside. The creation of rock and roll, Elvis Presley out here shaking his pelvis in the faces of teenage girls, and still in rock and roll from Black people. Civil rights movement is happening. in the 1950s. Racial uprisings, racial protests are going on. Organizations are forming. Nationalism is happening at this time all over the world. Anti-colonialist efforts are going on all over the world. There's a space race where there's a race to the moon. Which country is going to land on the moon first? Which country will be the first to go into space? All these things are happening. But women hadn't, a lot of suburban women had no idea because they were supposed to do what? Stay in the home. And if you did not do that, if you dare to get an education, if you dare to get a job, if you dare to get involved in the social movements and in the things that were happening in everyday life, if you dared to challenge this cultural norm, you were seen as crazy, neurotic. You were seen as a troublemaker, and you were definitely seen as somebody who wouldn't get married. Don't no man want to marry you. You're not going to ever have any children. And when your beauty starts to fade in your 30s and in your 40s, you'll never have a husband. And then what's your life going to be like now? What is your life going to be with no kids and no husband? If you dare to fight against this cultural norm. So the idea of the feminist mystique was deeply entrenched in the culture. So much so that women were embarrassed to talk about their lack of satisfaction in the lives that they had. And Friedan says that this problem went untreated and was eventually looked at as this isn't even a problem. It was happening so long and so many people were on board with it, so it was like, well, why are you even complaining? That's the problem that is not a problem, the problem with no name. So what is the feminine mystique? Sexual dissatisfaction. Sex research and gender research shows that a lot of women were very sexually dissatisfied. There were no conversations around women orgasms, very little conversations around women orgasms. There were very little conversations around the clitoris. There were very little conversations around mutual orgasms and anything like that. Not like how we have them now. Like maybe you might talk about in a sexuality class. Or you may just talk about with your friends or whatever. But huge levels of sexual dissatisfaction. We'll go into that in a second. Boredom. Women were going crazy, and they weren't going crazy because they were crazy. They were going crazy because they're stuck in this house. 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house, yes, in suburbia, but I'm here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, year after year. They feel trapped. What am I supposed to do in here? I can only vacuum the floor so many times. I can only wash the dishes so many times. I can only cook so much. And this gave them a lack of self-confidence. They felt like, is this all that I have? For a man to go out and to work and to make money and to be in different places and spaces, he's in his house, then he leaves his house, and he gets in his car or he gets on the train and he goes to work. He's able to see light, and he's able to interact with his friends at work, his coworkers, his colleagues. They maybe go out for drinks afterwards or go get a cup of coffee, go get something to eat, and then they come home. And then when he comes home, his wife is sitting there waiting for him with his slippers and his newspaper, and he sits in front of the TV and listens to whatever Dwight Eisenhower has to say on television and find out what's going on with the Vietnam War or the Korean War. Go to sleep, wake up. His life is fulfilled with something. And the whole time, the wife is just at home. Even the kids are going to school, playing on the playground, playing outside, coming back home, being with friends, spending the night at friends' houses. And the woman is just a placeholder. So there was a sense of dependency. There was no independency for women. They had to depend on their husbands for everything, for money, for a place to stay, for food. So if they were unlucky enough to have a husband who would get fired from his job because he was an alcoholic, or gamble away the mortgage money, or gamble away the rent money, or a husband that was abusive, there was nowhere for her to go. What was she going to do? But sit there. Why? Because she had no skills, or little skills. Very little opportunity for a job, very little opportunity for education. And even if she could go out and be a dishwasher, or be a cleaner, or be a maid, that was beneath her. Again, we're talking about white women, and those jobs were jobs that Black women did at the time. And again, we're gonna have a whole nother conversation around Black women. But these were jobs that Black women did. So what am I gonna do? I have nowhere to go. I don't have an education. I can't go be a teacher or live on my own. So guess what? I have to put up with the abuse. I have to put up with his cheating. I have to put up with the fact that I know he has another family on the other side of town. I have to put up with all of these things because I have nothing else going for me. I'm completely and utterly dependent on this man. So the American housewife was unhappy. And the unhappiness, again, did not come from material things or lack of material things, but it was these unanswered problems, which is what she called the feminine mystique. It was these unanswered problems of sexual dissatisfaction. Doctors tended to suggest that women had a sexual problem, and namely that working husbands couldn't satisfy their wives' increasing sexual appetite. And so doctors suggested that the housewives' lack of satisfaction was the result of them being locked up at home, waiting for her husband to return and give her a sense of being alive. That was the reason why they had this lack of sexual appetite, or lack of sexual satisfaction, sorry. But the reality is, there were very little real conversations around sex, not like the kind of conversations we have now. Very few real conversations around sex, and I just talked about it. Sexual satisfaction, what are things that men can do to bring pleasure to women, as well as the things that women can do to bring pleasure to men. Again, we're talking about this in a heteronormative sense. Homosexuality, this ain't even in the conversation at this time, because everything is heteronormative. That's another thing. If a woman really, I think there's a movie about this. I think that was part of the movie I'm getting ready to introduce you to as well. But women who really were attracted to other women who were really lesbians, you think they could come out? Absolutely not. So they definitely experienced dissatisfaction. And it was very common for a woman to really be attracted to another woman and have 4 and 5 kids. Jay-Z just talked about it in a album that came out a couple of years ago, 444. And he talked about how his mama had, 4 kids, I think? Jay-Z is the youngest. Was married to his father for a while. They got divorced, never married again, and recently just came out. But again, at that time, can't say anything like that. So women's sexuality was undermined. There were these conservative perceptions of the woman. The woman is not supposed to be sexual. The woman is not supposed to want an orgasm. The woman is supposed to have sex for the man. Very conservative ideas around sexuality. Even men could, it wasn't common, but could explore their sexuality with another man. He would definitely be ostracized if anybody found out. But that could happen. And then he can come home and explore his sexuality with his wife. So research of the time also said that women's fatigue was the result of the fact that they were bored. But Friedan says, no, it's not that they were bored. It's because that women tried to comply to what was expected of them, and they were locked in this invisible trap built on these half-truths, these misinterpreted ideas, and these unrealistic choices about their lives. And so Friedan said that there's a number of factors that led to women's, and she calls it women's incarceration in the house, which she says it led to early elements of depression. One of them, she said, was getting married super early. 2, she says, having these very large families. 3, she said, was the fact that women were called to do natural births and breastfeeding. Now we're finding out that particularly breastfeeding is actually the best way to provide your child with the nutrients that they need. But at that time, it was seen as uncouth, which is why even during slavery, Black women, if the white so-called slave master was pregnant, then the so-called white male slave master would impregnate an enslaved person, an enslaved woman, or make an enslaved man impregnate an enslaved woman so that they were both pregnant at the same time. Why? So that when the white wife delivered and her baby needed milk, they would then give that milk, that baby, to the enslaved woman, and she would nurse the baby. So there's several images on YouTube, on Google, you can find it, of Black women nursing white women, white babies. Why? Because that was seen as being what do you call it? Archaic, ancient, antiquated. Nobody does that. That is uncouth. You don't breastfeed your child. You don't have your child suck on your breast. That's what people do in the jungle. And obviously people thought that, Black people were from the jungles of Africa and blah, blah, blah. So that was common during that time. So when we see that here in the feminine mystique, even Betty Friedan she's a product of her time. So she doesn't necessarily believe in the breastfeeding thing either. But now we know breastfeeding is actually the best way to provide the nutrients that your child is going to need in the future. The neighborhood conformities and the lack of sexual satisfaction, which was rarely discussed in regards to women, all were the things that led to what we call the feminine mystique. But even during this time, there were women who dared to challenge this expectation. And so I want to introduce you to another movie I saw long before I really started studying feminism. Was a movie called Mona Lisa Smile. Maybe you've seen it, maybe you've heard of it, with Julia Roberts. And Mona Lisa Smile is a really good film that deals with gender issues in this era. But what I think they do better than Revolutionary Road is they tell a more complete story in that you see all the different sides of fighting for women's rights, but you also see where the conservative groups and the conservative women challenge this straightforward, one way, one track mind that a lot of the liberals and the pro-feminism, pro-women have. And also allow for them to learn a little bit from the women who were more conservative, women who believed in this feminine mystique, believed that women should be in the home. It's a really, really good thing. So I highly encourage you to check it out. Yeah, so click on that link. That's a clip from that film, so you can see that there were actually people who challenged these ideas. And then we'll come back and we'll go to the next slide. So some solutions. Dorothy Smith, in her text, A Woman's Standpoint, says that a sociology for women should be offered and would offer a knowledge of the social organization of properties and events in our daily world. Our academia should focus on women and women's issues. This is when you start to see a rise in women's studies and gender studies, particularly after the 1960s, after you start to see a rise in African American studies and cultural studies in colleges in like the latter part of the 1960s. And this was as a result of the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, and all these movements that were going on. And as this is happening, Latinx people are saying, well, we need at one point it was Chicano studies, and now it's Latinx studies or Hispanic studies, and then Asian American studies, cultural studies, women's departments. All of these started to pop up in the 70s as a result, right, of these larger movements that were going on in society. You also have to know that a socially constructed world comes from within. This is something else that Dorothy Smith said. Let's go to page 389 in your text. There we go. And so if we go down to the paragraph that says the only way of knowing, I think this is it. Yes, this is it. The only way of knowing, that paragraph. It says the only way of knowing a socially constructed world is knowing it from within. We can never stand outside it. A relation in which sociological phenomena are objectified and presented as external to and independent of the observer is itself a special social practice, also known from within. The relation of observer and object of observation of sociologist to subject is a specialized social relationship. Even to be a stranger is to enter a world constituted from within as strange. The strangeness itself is the mode in which it is experienced. So it is absolutely important that when we have these conversations about women, about women's issues, they have to come from within, from people who are actually a part of this community. Actual housewives, actual women scholars, actual women activists. This is why qualitative research is so important. You have to get these narratives, you have to get the stories of these people to really begin to understand what is it that we have to do to bring about solutions. So that's why I think that this reading is very important. All right, so now we're going to transition from modern day feminism, talking about that, into womanism and Black feminism, and now so we talked about gender, now we're going to add on the racial component. All right, so we are back, and going to start with our next slide. Questions around Black women gender consciousness. The other reading that we had was Audre Lorde, The Master's Tools Cannot Dismantle the Master's House. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what Audre Lorde is really going into and discussing. This is a very important tool and important work if you want to study Black women gender consciousness, Black feminism, Black womanism, etc. I would highly suggest this text as well. It's not one of those foundational texts, as far as I know. I'm not a Black woman scholar or race and gender scholar. I do know that it is an important text. I don't know if it's one of those seminal texts like Souls of Black Folk or Feminine Mystique or Black Feminist Thought, but it's definitely an important piece of work that Audre Lorde puts forth. And so we're going to be talking about what she's discussing in general with these next few slides. And so the questions that women, Black women specifically, who have this gender consciousness is asking, first, what does it mean to be a woman? Right? This is a global question. What does it mean to be part of this community of what we call women? Does it mean that you have certain organs? Does it mean that you live a certain life? Does it mean that you have a husband, have kids? What are the qualities of being a woman? And then the second part of that question that white women don't have to ask is, now, what does it mean to be Black in America? So what does it mean to be a woman? And then a separate question, what does it mean to be Black? And when asking the question around Black and Blackness, how do these answers converge with each other? But also, how do they repel each other? Is Blackness synonymous with being a man? When we say we need Black rights, or when we need rights for African Americans, are we talking about women too? Or are we just talking about men? Because when Black people got the right to vote during Reconstruction, that meant for men, because all women in general did not have the right to vote until 1919. By the time white women got the right to vote in 1919, Black people's right to vote was repealed through Jim Crow. So again, Black women still couldn't vote. Black women really didn't get it. Black men had the right to vote in Reconstruction, and it got repealed during Jim Crow, and then they got it back again in 1965 Voting Rights Act. Black women never got it until 1965, and white women got it in 1919. So when we're talking about Black rights, when we're talking about civil rights or rights, equal rights along the racial lines, do we mean Black women? Or are we just talking about Black men? And so then how can women be the ultimate self and the ultimate other? How can a Black woman be the woman, but then she's also othered because she's Black? So then what does it mean to be an African woman? What does it mean to have womanness and Black womanness at the center of Africana studies? This is a larger question. And then who and what defines what a woman is and what womanhood is? Can she define it for herself? Or is it based on what Black men say? Or is it based on what white men say? Because for a long time, it was based on what white men said. And then as more Black men came into power and began to fight for equality for Black people during the civil rights movement, they then told the women, hey, let's hold off on the gender conversation right now. Because once you help Black people get their rights, if you fight for the rights for the community, that's automatically going to bring you all into the equation. And many Black women say, okay, that sounds about right. We got to push this for our people. And the civil rights movement would have been nothing without the Black women involved. You hear about Dr. King, but we don't hear a lot about Ella Baker. You hear about Ralph David Abernathy, but we don't really hear about Fannie Lou Hamer. We hear a lot about Malcolm X, but we don't hear about Queen Mother Ollie Moore. There were many, 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 many Black women that were fighting behind the lines, putting their lives on the lines, speaking truth to power, getting their houses burned, getting their yards burned, getting death threats. Fannie Lou Hamer was sterilized purposely by a white hospital so that she could not have kids, and she didn't know. She was told it was a regular routine checkup. And they sterilized her on purpose because they didn't want her to have kids. These are the things that have happened to Black women for the sake of the movement. In return, Black men have largely, a lot of Black men have forgotten about Black women. And so when Black Lives Matter came back around, Black women say, nah, no more. We're not doing that again. We need the issues of Black women to be front and center. We need the issues of Black men to be front and center. We need all of our issues. And we're going to talk about issues for the LGBTQ community. We're going to talk about all these issues up front. We're not waiting no more. And they're absolutely right for that. So these are the complexities around Black women gender consciousness. Fighting the issues of race against white people in general, and a white system that oppresses them for their race, and then fighting the issues of gender against white men, white women, and Black men. So this is a very, very complicated conversation Black women are having. So quick overview, white feminism dating back to the latter part of the 19th century. It demonstrates that women were fully human. They were just as fully human as men. Historically, it was led by white middle-class women. And it gave us this kind of everyday theory of feminism, but it did not have all women in mind. It left out women of color. It focused mostly on white women who were middle class. If you were a poor white woman, we don't really want to have you around. That white feminist movement, these white women were well connected and married to some very powerful men. And if they weren't married, they had very good jobs or they had money from maybe their own financial situation or getting money from their mother or father that was passed down, probably the father that was passed down. Also focus on heterosexual women. We're not talking about lesbians. Oh, no, that is absolutely a no-no at this time. Very racially exclusive, ignored issues that other women in other classes were facing. So it excluded women like Harriet Tubman. It excluded Sojourner Truth. We talked about her. It excluded Ida B. Wells. We talked about her. It excluded Rosa Parks. All of these women who fought for racial rights, civil rights, racial equality, but also fought for women's rights. But a lot of these contributors are forgotten or ignored. And so it is through Black feminism, it is through womanism, it is through the Black gender consciousness that Black women keep these women's stories alive. And so again, doing just a quick recap before we go into the modern day womanism, modern day Black feminism. Again, we've talked about Sojourner Truth and our woman and how she challenged the way that Black women were treated in the 19th century and marginalized. You had women like Maria Stewart, who called upon African Americans to organize against slavery in the South, resist racial restrictions in the North. You had sisters like Ida B. Wells, who was an anti-lynching advocate. She was almost lynched herself. She was born in Mississippi, moved to Memphis, and then eventually to Chicago, and became one of the founders of the NAACP. Anna Julia Cooper. I mean, we've talked a lot about the good sister Anna Julia Cooper, Dr. Cooper, a voice from the South, by a Black woman from the South. The innovator, the pioneer of intersectionality and Black feminist thought. It is this foundation that Patricia Hill Collins gets the research and the theories around Black feminist thought. And so these individuals were considered race women, but a lot of times they are excluded from how they dealt with gender and sex discrimination and how they fought against gender and sex discrimination. And by the time you get to the 1960s, this is what they call the anger generation. Because now Black women are saying, all right, enough is enough. So you have white women who have this feminine mystique, and they have a certain narrative that is valid. And then Black women are saying, okay, and that's cool, and we can get behind that. But y'all talking about the issues around being in a suburban home and the issues around oppression and depression, and all of these are important, and this absolutely should be addressed. But we don't have those realities because we're living in the inner city. That suburbanism was created out of white flight. Y'all trying to get away from us in the inner city. So we're stuck in the inner city. We're stuck in the ghettos and in the projects of the city. Our husbands don't have the means to, many of them, right? Because you also have Black middle class people as well, but we'll talk about that in a second. But many of them did not have that lived reality. They could understand oppression just like white women could, but it wasn't because they were stuck in a house. They were working because their husbands didn't make enough money, or their husbands were laid off, or their husbands were mistreated at their job. So they had to work for the white women in these suburban homes. They traveled from the inner city to the suburbs, took buses early in the morning, left their kids at home, Now their kids have to raise themselves, go to school, come home, eat, do what they have to do. And then the mother who's been in the home, cleaning up for white women, cooking for white women, putting the white women kids to sleep, and then coming home, and then now they have to take care of their children. Patricia Hill Collins talks about this in Black Feminist Thought. I think I gave y'all that chapter to read. So I think y'all read that chapter. Also in books like The Help. So there's a different kind of gender consciousness that Black women have to deal with during this time. Much, much, much different. Not better or worse, but just different. They could not relate to what the white feminist movement was, what was happening in the white feminist movement. And the white women in their feminist movement could not relate to what the Black women were going through. And Black women are saying, we don't necessarily care about the housewife thing. We're being lynched. We can't vote. We can't go to school. We can't get a suburban house. We don't have access to wealth. It's a much different scenario we're dealing with. And we're worried about our boys, our sons, and our daughters being picked up by the police or being raped or our husbands. When they leave for work, will they come home? These are the things that we're worried about. So very different. So Black women's liberation was tied to these larger civil rights protests, jobs, housing, education. Sisters like Frances Beale in Double Jeopardy, To Be Black and Female, she states, let me state here and now that the Black woman in America can justly be described as a slave of a slave. What does that mean? She's saying if the Black man is a slave and the Black woman is under the Black man and has to serve the Black man who has to serve the white man, then the Black woman is the slave of the slave. She would later on be the founding member of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and be widely known for her publications on gender and racial equality. Pauli Murray, American civil rights activist, a lawyer, women's rights activist, a priest, first African-American woman to be ordained as a priest in the year that any women were ordained by the church. And of course, you have Audre Lorde, a feminist, a womanist, and activist. She wrote about heterosexism, homophobia. She was a Black woman. She was a mother. She was a lesbian. She was a warrior, a poet. Powerful, powerful, powerful woman. Audre Lorde, whose research and whose writings have sparked generations of women, of men, of people along these same lines, sparking discussions along these same lines. So when we think about the limitations of Black women and Black women's liberation, Black men upheld a lot of the traditional gendered roles and expectations. They believed in them. They had limited ideas around liberation for Black women. And Black women's liberation didn't look like white women's liberation. There was no notion of choice related to production. There was limitations when they discussed race. They were economically exploited through their bodies because they were paid very, very little money to work from sunup to sundown in the homes of white women. Exploitative jobs like domestic workers or hospital workers, getting paid crumbs just to try to take to their kids. So a very different scenario that Black women are dealing with. And this is why Audre Lorde writes, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Very, very powerful text. Very important piece. Now, I didn't have enough time. I was going back and forth about which assignment I would give you, and I felt the one that I decided to give you
would be better. And sometimes I make this in an assignment, but I said, you know what? I don't want to always have to bribe you with an assignment. And I do believe that some of you are really interested in this work. So, I'll just present this, and it's not going to be for a grade or anything, but I would highly suggest that you read Audre Lorde's Master's Tools Whenever Dismantle the Master's House. And I want you to answer these questions to yourself. Why is Audre Lorde upset? And does she have the right to be upset? And it's on the last paragraph on page 1 or the first 2 paragraphs on page 2. So, but actually that's, actually, I don't even know if that would be, yeah, actually, let me take that out, because this is a different document. Sometimes I upload this, and then sometimes I have the students read it out of this book, but it's not the same. So yeah, we'll just have you answer these questions. It appears that Audre Lorde is contradictory in her assertion that women can both be both in community with each other and different. How would you respond to the previous statement? For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. What does that statement mean according to Audre Lorde? And should those people who are being excluded educate the people that are doing the excluding? Who is responsible for these isms of racism and sexism and classism? What are our individual and collective solutions? So these are the questions I want you to think through and answer for yourself and ask yourself as you're reading this, this text. All right. This leads us into another phrase. You may have heard this phrase before. It's called misogynoir. Some people say you've heard the term misogynistic before. Misogyny. Actions that are used to negatively display or negatively view women. Misogynistic words and phrases that are used to speak down or to speak ill of women. Well, misogynoir is specific to Black women. The ways anti-Blackness and misogyny represent and shape broader ideas about Black women, particularly when you talk about visual spaces, cultural spaces, and digital spaces. A professor by the name of Moya Bailey came up with that. Misogynoir. She first coined that term, and she talks about it as a specific hatred or dislike or distrust towards Black women. And this was during a time when Black women were being depicted as ugly, as deficient, as hypersexual, unhealthy, worse than their non-Black counterparts. Beauty was whiteness, ugly was Blackness. Beauty was purity, ugly, Black or whiteness was purity, Blackness was hypersexuality. Whiteness was smart and intelligent and humble. Blackness was loud, stupid, dumb. And so Bailey talks about, when she presents the concepts around misogynoir, explores how Black women have bravely used platforms and media and social media to confront it in these very courageous ways, particularly in the new age, particularly using misogynoir to now talk about queer and trans Black women. So she talks about how misogynoir has
brought about the importance of creating spaces where communities are being built for queer Black women, using hashtags like girls like us, right? All of this falls under that concept. And the way in which misogynoir takes place in the larger life is how Black girls are oftentimes viewed as older or more mature and more sexually advanced than white girls, which is why, and even to this day, or even in very recent times, you can get more time for raping a white woman than you can for raping a Black woman. There's actually been research, recent research in Boston, criminology research that shows, on average, a rapist will get more time for raping a white woman than raping a Black woman. And this dates back to this idea that Black women are these hypersexual beings that inadvertently and maybe subconsciously they deserve it because they really like it. This is the justification that was used during slavery. And deep down, Patricia Hill Collins says it's the same way now. Why there is these disproportionate numbers around the sexual assault of white women versus the sexual assault of Black women. Well, these Black women, they develop so early, you really can't even tell. She's 14, but she looks 20. It's fine. That's why when R. Kelly recently was found guilty on all charges, it was a big deal because they're saying, wow, for once, because all this was happening to little Black girls finally got justice. So this is misogynoir taking place and playing out in real life. Doctors also perceive Black women as having a higher pain threshold, so they're treated differently. I have a whole lecture on that. But, and there you can Google this. Sometimes I'll show this in my classes as well. I didn't put it up here because I don't want to bombard you with a whole bunch of YouTube links. But there is this YouTube link that went viral not too long ago of an Indian doctor who admitted out of his mouth on camera in a televised interview as saying that generally speaking, doctors don't really believe Black women when they say they're in pain. There's this idea that they can withhold pain more than white women. So most of the time they're not believed. And when things end up going awry or it gets too bad, sometimes it's too late when what they actually said was true. And this is what happened with Serena Williams. And she almost died having her child. This is also what happened with Kim Porter, the mother of P. Diddy's children, but she actually passed away from something that she told her doctor she was suffering from. She told them to check her out. They told her she was fine. And she said, I don't think I'm fine. And she ended up dying from what it was that she made that connection with. So these things really happen. Black women are often viewed as threatening or angry whenever they speak up for themselves. It's the angry Black woman. Maternal mortality rates for Black women are 3 times higher than white women. Because of the stereotype of the strong Black woman, many Black women feel that they can't show emotion or show pain. Black women are often viewed as overly sexual when they wear clothes that fit their bodies. You see that with Serena Williams, who was well endowed, and when she wears certain clothes, certain skirts, there was a time where people said that she was promoting sexuality on the court. She said, I'm just wearing clothes. These are the skirts that fit me. styles that are deemed unacceptable when worn by Black women are celebrated when worn by white women. So cultural appropriation, the wearing of braids, the wearing of locks. All of these are examples of how misogynoir plays out in real life, right? For your discussion assignment, this is interesting. I went back and forth on if I should give you this assignment or not, and I decided to do it. And then I went back and forth on if I should show the actual image or not, and I decided not to do it, but here's a link to it, and you can see it for yourself. So Meek Mill is a modern day rapper, and he recently released an album. And I thought this might be an interesting discussion for the class. It would have been a larger discussion for the class if we were in person, but I think this would be cool to interact with on your discussion posts. Rapper Meek Mill recently came under fire in the past couple of weeks because he had an album cover. So you can look at the link below and you can click on it and you'll just scroll down and you'll see a couple of images of the album cover. Some people, both white and Black, and male and female, stated that this cover was absolutely disrespectful to Black women. They said it was misogynoir. They said it was hypersexualization of Black women. And they were absolutely against it. Boycott this album cover. Boycott Meek Mill, cancel Meek Mill. This is horrible. Meek Mill responded by saying, well, a Black woman designed the cover for me. And other people felt it was not misogynoir. It was not hypersexualization. It showed freedom of sexual expression. It showed freedom of Black women exploring themselves, exploring their sexuality. Isn't that what Betty Friedan would want? Black women to be free sexually, if they want to take off their clothes, if that's something that they want to do. So there's a link to the album cover. What are your thoughts on the album cover? Do you think it's misogynoir? Or is it Black feminism? Is it freedom of expression? Or is it a combination of both? Depends. And it's a very interesting topic. And maybe even consider the fact that a Black woman designed it for him. To some people, they may say that doesn't matter. People within a group sell out all the time. Some people may say, well, it does matter. This person represents Black women. If she says it's okay, then it's okay. But does that mean it's okay? If somebody in that group says it's okay. There's some Black people who voted for Donald Trump. Does that mean that all Black people like Donald Trump? No. So we don't really know. But I want you to think through that. And I want you to use thoughts, concepts, and ideas from the readings and lectures to support your argument. What do we talk about with misogynoir? What do we talk about with the feminine mystique? What do we talk about sexual expression? What do we talk about with gender, race and gender consciousness? All these different things. And I want you to use that to inform how you respond. And I want you to use that to respond to another student's post. So I'm really interested in this discussion. So I look forward to reading your responses. And all of the instructions should be fulfilled before noon on November 8th. Okay. All right, wrapping up this lecture. So there were some limitations to Black feminism. Black feminism was derived from the term feminism, so some people still felt that it was predominantly academic and ideological. Black feminism still represented this reactionary ideology to feminism, so it didn't stand alone. It was similar to other groups that it does not elevate all forms of oppression. You're only talking about Black heterosexual women, middle class Black women, educated Black women. What about the poor and working class Black women? What about Black women who are not African American? What about the theories that you use? A lot of these theories in early Black feminism still were European-centered theories. These were theories based on what white women said or white men said, for that matter. So there were some limitations to early Black feminism. Some people felt it lacked spirituality. That's what womanism brings in. We'll talk about womanism in the next slide. And then it focuses primarily on Black women, not inclusive of other populations of women. So what about Hispanic women? What about Latinas? What about Asian women? What about Black women who were not Black American? What about Caribbean women? What about African women? What about Afro-Latino women? What about Afro-British women? So then this is where you come up with womanism. And womanism came about based on the teachings of Alice Walker in Search of Our Mother's Gardens. That's another very important text. If you want to study Black feminism and womanism, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens is a big one. Most of you have probably heard of The Color Purple or have seen the movie The Color Purple. This is a foundational text for women to start right here. And womanism says that it is not a version of feminism. They said it's very different. They say feminism is like lavender, womanism is like purple. Looks similar, but very different. You see somebody with a purple outfit on, you see somebody with a lavender outfit on. If you see them separately, you may say, oh, is that purple? Or is that lavender or purple? But when you see them next to each other, very different. That's how they say womanism is. That's why that's called The Color Purple. That's where that title comes from. From in the book, where she says feminism is lavender, woman is purple. Because womanism focuses on the aesthetic of the spiritual and creative self. It focuses on the Black woman as the woman that is a part of the Black community. Feminism oftentimes looked at white men as the enemy. Black women in womanism says we cannot afford to look at Black men as the enemy because our Blackness is necessary for our survival. We need each other, but we also need to be able to check our Black men when they get out of line and check our Black men when they are perpetuating misogyny. They focus on more of a spirituality concept, not just the academics, not just the theories, but how do we feel spiritually? How do we connect back to our African selves? What are the interconnections between me as a woman, me as a Black person, and then me as a divine being? Womanism says that women have the power and authority to exercise this responsibility, and they do it alongside men, not in absence of men, which is an idea that is largely promoted in feminism. So the womanist movement creates opportunities for now other women of color to form their own versions of feminism and own versions of womanism. So it is out of womanism that you have African womanism. On the next slide, Clenora Hudson Weems. You have hip hop feminism, Joan Morgan. You have other examples of women who have now created these pan-nationalist, pan-Africanist, diasporic views of what womanism can be. Shelby Lewis, also a large contributor to Africana womanism. And this leads to other people, other authors, Black feminist thought author Patricia Hill Collins, as well as Black feminist anthropology author Irma McClarty. All of these are extensions of womanism. So in conclusion, how can we do better about including Black women in the discussion of feminism and equality? Number one, we normalize the expansion of women and what it means to be a woman. Non-binary women. Expand the ideas around gender and what that means. Elect Black women with this mindset to positions of power. Black women who have the mindset of creating opportunities for women, for Black people, for all marginalized people. And then financially support Black women groups like Black Mamas Matter Alliance, the Loveland Foundation, Buy from a Black Woman, Black Girls Code. All of these are ways that we can address and promote ideas around race and gender consciousness. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture. I hope you learned a lot from it. Make sure that you complete the discussion assignment. Make sure that you're taking notes, and hopefully you're enjoying these things we're talking about and watching and learning. Look forward to reading your responses, and I'm trying to leave more comments on some of them. But definitely, if you want to just have a conversation with me or want me to comment specifically on yours, you can always reach out to me and I'll do that. So yeah, with that being said, have a great week. Have a great weekend. I'll see you later, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any additional questions.